Those who are not quite at home in a body, a discipline, a world, have much to teach us about how things are built, that is to say, have much to teach us about the uses of use.
1997 and 98. I learned to play the trumpet, I learned to read and write music. I write music as a matter of course. For me as a 4-year-old child, this is the most normal thing in the world. Musical notation becomes for me a carrier of word and message, impression and expression, a communication system with which I negotiate my place in the world with myself and others even before I start school. Me, back then, why did Bach compose music? My mother back then, so that he could survive. Bach's passions had a great influence on my later understanding of theatre as more than dramatic audio theatre pieces with their contemplative tableauness, their immersive ritualness, their alternation between narrative, dialogic and highly symbolic language, their associative, allegorical and at the same time systematic and formal arrangement of action and various levels of commentary. The musical notation that allowed me so much in my childhood and youth later became kind of a prison for me when I had to work incredibly hard for years, basically still have to work on it today, to emancipate myself from what it dictates. It is anything but a tabula rasa. It prioritizes certain parameters such as rhythm and pitch over others, such as timbre, tonal texture and expression, and is terribly imprecise when it comes to dynamics. Anyone who learns musical writing, Notenschrift, or rather musical notation language, Notensprache, more or less as a mother tongue, thus practices a certain understanding of the world from childhood onwards, which favors and discriminates, prioritizes, hierarchizes, focuses, and ignores. In musical notation language, certain factors such as energy, presence, control, and many others cannot be expressed at all. Here we already enter the realm of the theatrical in the sense that a more directly communicative way of working than musical notation, even with its many extensions, is necessary. More on this later. In any case, in 1998, and for many years to come, the limits of musical notation are, to paraphrase Wittgenstein's famous sentence, the limits of my world, at least on the musical level, and the musical has by far the largest share of my world at that time. Nevertheless, the desire for conscious control of the new means and forms will arise in every artist's mind, and he will wish to know consciously the laws and rules which govern the forms which he has conceived as in a dream. Strongly convincing as this dream may have been, the conviction that these new sounds obey the laws of nature and our manner of thinking, the conviction that order, logic, comprehensibility, and form cannot be present without obedience to such laws, forces the composer along the road of exploration. He must find, if not laws or rules, at least ways to justify the dissonant character of these harmonies and their successions. Arnold Schönberg, 1950. 2009-2010, I spent many hours a day at the organ. I play the organ quite well, and making polyphonic contrapuntal music with my hands and feet and a lot of brain power fascinates me. All alone on the organ bench, my whole body is engaged. I know where every single limb belongs. I know where to go with myself. That gives me stability and structure in life. I am not actually socialized to theater. I was never in a theater club or something. The days of my childhood and youth are structured by music: classical music, church music, contemporary music, and jazz. I pursue music with great seriousness and earnestness. My parental home is strongly influenced by Protestantism, although my elementary school is Catholic. The symbolic world of both major Christian religions is still very familiar to me today, another language that I can speak fluently, in which for many years explained the world, its order and structure to me, suggesting dependability and coherence. My father also got me interested in politics early on. I read his GDR editions of Marx and Lenin and understand nothing, but no matter, revolution is the main thing, and the idea that there are better spaces, spaces of belonging, justice and solidarity, not yet real but virtual, to be imagined and prepared and embellished by us. Then there's literature, stories by Kafka and Dostoevsky, poems by Trakl and Ben, gloomy, expressionistic, cruel, symbolistic, full of metaphors. My depressive teenage soul adores Mahler's symphonies and the catastrophic opulence of Bernd Ollis Zimmermann. It understands how text montage, sound quotations, gestures, symbols, images, styles, recourse to centuries-old liturgical forms, etc., serves to create ambiguous allegories into which it, the soul, can pour itself out completely with all its not understanding itself and not being understood, in the hope that someone will one day recognize the right codes between the lines. Without ever having heard of something like postmodern theater, it creates a musical theater in several tableaus with a wild text collage of poetry, prose, and the Bible, with props overloaded with meanings and ritually enraptured movement choreography. And now the trick again with musical notation. This 15-year-old soul finds incredible relief in the distance it can build up to its own misunderstood feelings when it can translate and objectify them into this incredibly complicated technical notation, whereby the limits of the musical notation mother tongue, which are the limits of the world, are already being pushed to and gently beyond their limits. This 15-year-old soul sees the language of musical notation as the only adequate mirror of its own seemingly impenetrable complexity. A mirror that may be able to give it back some knowledge, some stability, even if it's only the consolation of having inscribed itself in a structure of sound sources and bar numbers, of space and time and meaning, composing as self-understanding. Perhaps also a bit of defiance and satisfaction in the fact that the composer is autonomous in their writing and needs no one but themselves, composing as self-assertion and demarcation.
Nevertheless, I am interested in a theatre that does not constantly multiply the signs. I am interested in inventing a theatre where all the means that make up theatre not only illustrate and duplicate each other, but where they all retain their own powers but work together, and where one no longer relies on the conventional hierarchy of means. In other words, where a light can be so strong that you suddenly just watch the light and forget the text, where a costume speaks its own language, or where there is a distance between speaker and text, and a tension between music and text. I always find theatre exciting when there is a sense of distance on stage that I can then cover as an audience member. So I try to invent a kind of stage reality that also has something to do with the buildings, with the architecture or construction of the stage and its own laws, and which also finds resistance there. For example, I am definitely interested in the fact that a space also formulates a movement, has a time.
2016. The Nevitzen Records at the Munich Biennale, my first practical experience with contemporary music theatre. And such an enormous project. 6 hours of music theatre on an area of 1,000 square meters divided into 13 rooms that are performed synchronously. For everyone involved, the Nevitzen Records becomes what director Till Wieler von Balmus had hoped for, a parallel universe, a different world with its own rules in which they increasingly make themselves at home. 3 composers and 3 sound artists produce enormous masses of sound material. However, composition takes place here not only in a musical but in a much broader sense. Sounds, spaces, movement choreographies, objects, texts, transformations, atmospheres, bodies, video, light, fog, encounters, scientific inputs, and much more are the compositional material that is arranged, interlocked, layered, opposed, condensed, thinned out, detached, solidified, transformed by decisions of individuals or groups, artists or audience, will or chance. Every night is different, every night an independent live composition that is spontaneously assembled from rehearsed and improvised components. Unrepeatable scenes, magical experiences and social situations emerge, and something like a knowledge of great beauty and depth of insight that can only be inscribed in memories and follow-up works. Till Wieler von Balmus' directional work in the Nevitzen Records is fundamentally based on first creating strong frames, pouring in excessive amounts of material and then continuously inducing moments in which you can lose control of the material or allow it to be snatched away. This approach is highly compositional in the deconstructivist sense, or perhaps rather decompositional, like an enormous meter counterpoint with tons of sand in the gears. He asked the performers to work against him. He asked the participants to sabotage the processes. He does everything he can to confront people with each other and, above all, himself with them and their will. He asked the assistant director to write a dysfunctional schedule for the first run-through rehearsals, one that doesn't work because people have to be in 2 places at the same time, because 2 rooms have to be next to each other that are not next to each other, because time has to run backwards. The plan is only sent around shortly before the rehearsal starts. He's interested in how creative people deal with the impossible, how they grasp the big picture and use their individual means and perspectives to find ways to keep it going, how they cross the threshold into the uncertain and untested because the supposedly certain leads them by the nose. He's interested in their relationship to the surrounding social, spatial, temporal and functional structures, composition as the shaping of one's own relationship to time, and also quite comprehensively to the world, more on that later. He's very honestly interested in the already known and yet to be discovered potential of each individual contributor. In the following years, I seek out theatre as a working context. I pursue a master's degree in applied theatre studies in Gießen and establish a performance collective, the Paranormal Queer Group. There I keep finding this wild, debauched, anarchic, playful energy that takes collective thinking into the most absurd regions and generates exuberant amounts of ideas and material in a short period of time. But I am also confronted with the harsh reality of theatre, for which I am not really prepared. I experience psychological violence, authoritarian directors, debates about abuse of power in which people despair, exhaust themselves, burn out. It dawns on me that the structures here are often not there to offer support, but to be fulfilled.
Collections liberate from the constraints of a narrative.
Later that year, I attend a course in Gießen with Björn Auftrag and Stefanie Lorey, a scenic project entitled Sammeln und Ordnen, Collecting and Organizing. Looking through my notes, I stick to this sentence from the introductory session. It has to be understood in the context of genres that have legitimized and defined themselves for centuries through the existence of a narrative, such as drama or fiction, which now compete with a wide variety of post-dramatic, post-narrative, post-modern and experimental formats. Thus, the accumulation of material in theatre and literature can be a way to bring about a rapprochement and transcendence with music in 2 respects, not only because performative and textual material can be used to compose, but also because music has always been free from the compulsion to narrate.
You think so much in classical counterpoint.
20, 23, 24, 25, zoomed in. I'm sitting in a composition class evening at a music academy in Germany. I find some pieces pointed or sophisticated, some charmingly youthful or naive, but a lot of it bores me because it's so well behaved, so lawful and smooth. I think of Stefan Prinz's comment. Few moments from my Meisterklasse have moved me as powerfully and lastingly as that sentence, because it was so incredibly true, and it was a truth that had been standing like an elephant in the room for years. The counterpoint was at the source, at the subconscious primordial seat of what I had believed about music basically all my life. Stefan's comment was like a pair of glasses he put on me to reveal the dimension in which this belief lay peacefully dormant. Without these glasses, my pieces of the last 2 years would not have become what they are, this essay would not have been written, my thinking about music would be different, and I would not have reopened this whole big question of form and structure so fundamentally. Since then, I see counterpoint everywhere, in contemporary music and pop music, in hardcore, metal, in techno, but of course also in non-musical forms such as literature, visual arts and theater. Please don't get me wrong, classical counterpoint is not a bad thing, and the fact that it is so ever-present speaks precisely to the fact that it has its models and equivalents in everyday processes of action and reaction, in the course of conversations, in the intertwining of traffic flows in the city. But if counterpoint is so stubbornly persistent, it deserves to be fed with everything imaginable and possible, because it is a factory with the weirdest machines that don't really care what material you pour into them. They eat everything. On a mild spring evening in 2025 in Charlottenburg, Berlin, I stumbled into a film shoot for the TV series Kudam 77 and was able to observe the filming of a scene lasting about 10 seconds. I had never been on a film set before, and I was incredibly fascinated by the precise interlocking of the elements that would later come together on the screens as an image composition with foreground and background structure, Hauptstimme and Nebenstimme, so to speak. A cab rolls up, stops, 2 people get out, seemingly by chance, but in fact of course perfectly timed. 2 more people come out of a pub on the corner at exactly this moment and walk across the street in front of the cab. The cab driver waits for these 2 passers-by and then drives off, turning left into this cross street where, again perfectly timed, another car has already driven off in the opposite direction 2 seconds before, so that the 2 cars meet exactly in the middle of the intersection, one turning left, the other turning right. Contrapuntal compositional thinking at its best.
Being taken seriously means missing out on the chance to be frivolous, promiscuous, and irrelevant. The desire to be taken seriously is precisely what compels people to follow the tried and true paths of knowledge production around which I would like to map a few detours. Indeed, terms like serious and rigorous tend to be code words, in academia as well as other contexts, for disciplinary correctness. They signal a form of training and learning that confirms what is already known according to approved methods of knowing, but they do not allow for visionary insights or flights of fancy. I propose that instead the goal is to lose one's way, and indeed to be prepared to lose more than one's way.
Back to the class evening. I listened to one piece after the other, each lasting only 4 or 5 minutes. In each piece, other students perform with their instruments. All of them have practiced perfectly and perform the pieces with great seriousness. They play a lot of notes. Many pieces are fast and dense, sometimes really virtuosic and difficult. Each note dictates a pitch and a note value. They hit the pitches, they hit the right length, they intonate and they phrase. They do brilliantly what is required from them as young classical musicians. The notes do not come from them, they come from the composers, and they, the composers, have fished them out of a hodgepodge of conventions, unconscious listening experience, conscious listening, score study, free experimentation, and technical tinkering. They have translated them into musical notation in order to communicate them, and now, no doubt, they have also described or demonstrated in personal conversation how they would like it to be. I think of the countless rehearsals in which musicians have asked me how I would like it to be, or what I would like to hear in this or that passage, and how uncomfortable that always made me. Telling other people what to do is not something I really enjoy. I like giving impulses and suggestions, initiating ways of thinking, establishing logics, creating frameworks in which we can think together about what could be done and heard. The score, since the 19th century, doesn't really allow this. With the score, the composer, der Komponist, male, communicates what others should do. He defines what is right and to be taken seriously, exactly what is written there, and what is wrong and not to be taken seriously, everything else. He commands, he mansplains, and he manspreads himself into the time that his music lasts, his immaterial property, the vast majority of which represents nothing more than an appropriation of conventions and notes written before him. Of course, I'm exaggerating a tiny little bit. This in itself is a convention that would never have come into being without European concepts of domination, progress, private property, masculinity, honor, and individual freedom. The score, protected by copyright, allows no contradiction and relatively little negotiation. It says, I have decreed it this way. It says, it's sink or swim, friss oder stirb. Its communication is unidirectional and definitely not non-violent. With the score from the Romantic period onwards, the composer, just like the Regie Theater director, promotes himself to the position of the sovereign as characterized by Giorgio Agamben. Again. He creates the law or the structure, the information, the dictation to which he alone does not have to submit, but for whose success he is nevertheless indispensable, because otherwise there would supposedly be no law or no structure, no information, no dictation at all. Before sound carriers for actual sound spread, the score was the most precise and comprehensive way of preserving sounds, and was obviously legitimized by this, but this monopoly position has disappeared long ago. The score, if you want to work with it, can now be designed much more as an invitation to translate and transfer, to engage with unfamiliar logics, to fill in empty spaces, perhaps even purely imaginary, to co-create, to make spontaneous or prepared decisions, to queer, to hack, or even to sabotage. What is actually fruitful about the score is that it is a detour with purpose, a communicative intermediate step, at one end of which is the translation of idea into writing, and at the other end the translation of writing into sound or other actions. Of course, many artists before me have already understood this friendly potential of the score. I'm thinking of the extensive and very sophisticated use of emojis in the scores of Thierry Tidro, or the audio scores of Trond Reinholdsen, which he creates individual for each performer in his shows with great warmth, humor, and personal affection, without abolishing himself as a composer who controls everything from the outside, but with immense trust in the community spirit of his performers. I believe that theatre in particular, where stubbornly following instructions is no longer the order of the day, is a fertile breeding ground for new score concepts that encourage originality and group creation. In teaching stage direction students, for example, I have long been using the experimental scores of Lamont Young or David Helbig. The success of this method is obvious because the students immediately understand that pretty much everything can be translated into scores, and scores can be retranslated into pretty much anything, so at best they can function like a wormhole of abstraction from one concrete area into a completely different concrete area. As invitations for sometimes complex performative, sonic, or causal processes in time and space, the scores of Fluxus and the successors are a great example of how not only compositional thinking is reflected in theatrical practice, but also how contemporary theatrical thinking finds its way into the thinking of open-minded composers and musicians. In this sense, I would like to plead for much more theatrically informed compositional practice.
They say representation. We say experimentation. They say identity. We say multitude. They say patrol the banlieues. We say mesticize the city. They say debt. We say sexual cooperation and somatic interdependence. They say human capital. We say multi-species alliance. They say horse meat. We say let's ride horses to escape the global slaughter together. They say power. We say potential. They say integration. We say open source. They say man-woman, white-black, human-animal, homosexual, heterosexual, Israel-Palestine. We say, do you know that your apparatus of truth production no longer works? We are the living, decentralized network. We want a total citizenship defined by the sharing of techniques, fluids, seeds, water, knowledge.
Conventional European art music since the 19th century has been an enormously binary practice. It knows can and cannot, right and wrong, beautiful and not beautiful, tonal and atonal, the composer and the performers and the audience. It practically knows no in between. It knows men and for some years no women and no in between. Queerness is completely alien to it. Castrati no longer have a place in it, fortunately, but countertenors only quite recently, and low-singing women as well as non-binary artists basically not yet at all. It knows and defines itself, music, within narrow limits, and it knows, or rather believes it knows, the other arts, dance, theatre, visual arts, and so on, and smiles at them a little. Stefanie Schulter pointed out in the preliminary discussion for this conference that the supposedly structured music is often connoted as male, the supposedly emotionally oriented dance as female. One more reason to look for the radically non-binary here. European art music is a disciplinary practice on many different levels, which would be worth exploring in separate text. It demands great seriousness and earnestness from everyone involved, a knowledge, appreciation and cultivation of its spatial, temporal and social structures. The score is its central disciplinary medium and means. Jack Halberstam writes, quote, "Disciplines qualify and disqualify, legitimate and delegitimate, reward and punish. Most importantly, they statically reproduce themselves and inhibit dissent," unquote. The spaces of classical romantic music manifest a hard boundary between a very exclusive inside and an outside that is also supposed to remain outside at all costs. When it breaks in unplanned, however, as it did in 2023 with some gluing actions of the last generation, it causes such unrest that people who see themselves as sophisticated are capable of the most disturbing obscenities. Of course, I will not deny that Romanticism devoted its greatest attention to the in-between in the opposition of life and death, to death wish, transfiguration and resurrection. That Mozart was particularly interested in the vocal vulnerabilities of his singers, certainly not out of pure malice. That there is, of course, amazing music on the spectrum between tonal and atonal. That brilliant works were written for the one-armed pianist Paul Wittgenstein, who would actually have fallen through the cracks of normative skill and mastery. And I admit that I sometimes enjoy to write superfixed scores too. Young people for whom diversity, queerness, participation, post-colonialism, etc. are neither foreign words nor fads are moving up in the classical music business. The grey areas do exist. And yet, European art music by and large squanders the potential of ambiguity and excludes people from creation, interpretation and reception, regardless of the creative potential, through convention, architecture, class and ritual. Quote, "So-called classical music is based on the endless repetition of a closed canon. Even the most radical break is often ritualized," unquote, writes sociologist Cesar Rendueles. So what are the ways out? Perhaps first of all, on an individual level, stop nurturing illusory hopes and placing them in rusty structures. Replace hope with defiance and find a mixture of self-created structures, rusty structures that you queer or hack, and rusty structures that you accept with as little personal energy expenditure as possible.
How can recognition for outstanding individual talents, physical strength, social skill? They say there are hardly any conventions for collective authorship, especially in the field of the sounding arts. This opens up enormous freedom in the discovery, development, application, and further development of a variety of new methods. The new working situation is an invitation to try out an experiment with open-ended results, media such as shared online docs, recorded Zoom sessions, jointly read, heard, watched inputs, texts, films, podcasts, protocols, chats, work diaries, mind maps and methods such as chain letters, critique discussions, negotiation, voting, rearrangement, variation, deconstruction, addition, subtraction, multiplication, manipulation, overwriting, meditation, mediation, parody, live and instant composition can play a role. Working together enables the empathic adoption of different perspectives rooted in the various disciplines, with the ears of a scenographer, with the eyes of a composer, improves individual self-reflection and self-criticism, and is thus always also a self-organized educational process and continuous mutual broadening of horizons. All participants teach, or share, and learn at the same time, not only by creating, receiving, criticizing, thinking ahead, etc., but also by taking risks and losing control together, creating for each other, failing together. Collaborative practice is often also a search for the productive potential in what one is not so good at oneself.
On a methodological level, I compiled some ideas for compositional work in collaborative contexts 4 years ago in this article for the Neue Zeitschrift für Musik, which were primarily generated from my experiences as a member of transdisciplinary collectives. Experimental ensembles are also increasingly working with such methods, the development of which was pioneered by independent theatre. In addition to these methodological bridges between the disciplines, working on a common vocabulary is also a task that should not be underestimated and must be pursued continuously if we want to learn from each other and produce theatrically informed composition or compositionally informed theatre. Working in collectives requires directors and composers to radically abandon the academic doctrine of you must always know exactly what you want. The position of sovereign no longer exists, or at most in a rotating form. Likewise, all the binaries mentioned dissolve. Control mixes with chance to create deliberate non-repeatability. Structure mixes with chaos to create permeably delimited, focused spaces and periods of possibility. Audience mixes with performers to create temporary communities of people who can and cannot, know and do not know something. Capability mixes with non-capability to create different capability, a little bit of capability, or simply professional dilettantism. AI mixes with human intelligence to create the unpredictable.
How can recognition for outstanding individual talents, physical strength, social skills, aesthetic talent, faculty of abstraction, be reconciled with a project of coexistence based on radical equality? In the practices that we, to be honest, very imprecisely, call cultural, we can experiment with the complexity of egalitarian projects that are not based on leveling down, but distrust privilege.
Compositional thinking helps here with its stringency, its structural focus, its practice in interweaving material, its ability to vary, sharpen and fragment, its creation of clear forms and temporal structuring without narrative. Theatrical thinking contributes the full spectrum available to it between concretion and abstraction, its psychology, its process orientation, its focus on the human being in its humanity and the object in its objecthood. Transdisciplinary laboratories as a hacking space, as a chemistry set of ambiguities.
Use teaches how we pick things up because of their material or physical qualities, which is to say, given what they allow us to do. Even if intentions do not exhaust possibilities, even if there is something queer about use, something cannot be used for anything. Use is a restriction of possibility that is material. Even when we use something in ways that were not intended, a cup as a paperweight, for instance, we do so given the qualities of a thing. Perhaps when we use something in ways that were not intended, we are allowing those qualities to acquire freer expression. The keys that are used to unlock a door can be used as a toy, perhaps because they are shiny and silver, perhaps because they jangle. Queer uses, when things are used for purposes other than the ones for which they were intended, still reference the qualities of things. Queer uses may linger on those qualities, rendering them all the more lively. A phenomenology of usefulness would attend to how use involves a way of arranging worlds as well as ourselves.
The theatrical view on music making and its means makes it possible for me to view, for example, the violin as a perhaps sophisticated but nevertheless quite ordinary wooden box with a handle and 4 wires, a chemistry set in micro-possibility space in the literal sense, which offers me nothing more but also nothing less than a stable framework for all kinds of anarchy and misappropriation. It can itself become a theater stage, as in Simon Sten Andersen's works, and the sonic composition a derivative of performative processes. Without this distance to the instrument, my view of the violin would always be conventionally distorted, and I could only see it as a relic full of aura and history, whose correct use is prescribed to me in general by its structural architecture and in specific terms by musical notation in 3 parameters: pitch, rhythm, and dynamics. Whoever writes for violin copies, Johannes Kreiler once wrote, and I copy it.
Under certain circumstances, failing, losing, forgetting, unmaking, undoing, unbecoming, not knowing may in fact offer more creative, more cooperative, more surprising ways of being in the world. Failing is something queers do and have always done exceptionally well, for queers' failure can be a style, or a way of life, and it can stand in contrast to the grim scenarios of success that depend upon trying and trying again.
Or also this, radically reversing the signs and standards in order to escape the logic of right and wrong, of qualify and disqualify, legitimate and delegitimate, reward and punish, either or. Using instruments, spaces, bodies, tools and devices in a queer way, using them deliberately, incorrectly, using them differently, systematizing unintentional mistakes, being curious about where they lead you when you allow control to slip away a little, when the supposedly self-evident no longer applies and you start to really play with them, to understand them as a Spielzeug, as a means of play, full of facets, details and surprises. Leaving the discipline, distancing oneself from its conventions and penetrating the transdisciplinary space imposes itself in order to achieve this great freedom and conquer the huge potential. Surprise instead of plannedness, as in the Nevitzen records, circuitousness instead of straightforwardness, as in Befriending Ghosts by the Paranormal Queer Group, dilettantism instead of mastery, as in Back on Stage in the beginning of this lecture, boredom and refusal, as in Geht dann gleich los in the very beginning, queering and radical reappropriation, as in my research with Johannes Schropp, in which violins were used from a purely choreographic perspective, radical community, as in Queer Room by the Paranormal Queer Group, or play, as in Yes, 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 and defiance.
Ich bin ein extrem hoffnungsloser Mensch.
I am an extremely hopeless person, in the sense that I know that the things I am working and fighting for, I don't have the slightest hope that they will be realized in any way in the immediate future or that I will live to see them. I'm actually always in favor of not getting your hopes up. Then I'm sometimes asked, yes, but okay, what's the motivation behind your work? And for me it's defiance. So despite the hopelessness, despite the circumstances, despite the realization that things will probably just get a lot worse in the next few years at least than they are now, and that's somehow also good, because it also makes you humble in a certain way. But I think if I didn't have the defiance, then I wouldn't do a lot of the things that I do.
Wenn ich das nicht hätte, dann würde ich sehr viele Sachen nicht tun, die ich tue.
20, 23, 24, 25 zoomed out. I am in a comprehensive transition process. I change my appearance, I change my voice, I start hormone therapy. My way of working is in constant flux. I have, well, not turned my back on the theater, but I no longer place such high hopes in it. I place my hopes in other formats, working methods and contexts. I listen to a podcast with Shada Kurt, in which she talks about hope and defiance. I don't want to completely agree with her, but somehow it does something to me. It has something to do with me. I open up new contexts of political engagement and social being. Several knots burst. My horizons and my understanding of who I am, what I want, and what is possible for me are constantly expanding. I'm learning a lot, a great deal. Some insights come to me in a flash, such as my new self-chosen first name, such as the answer I have been looking for decades to the questions of what composing actually means to me and why I have to do it. It is a strategy of being in the world, of locating myself in the world, of processing world, of sorting, analyzing, categorizing, acting through, affirming, negating, twisting, relating and rearranging the impressions that pelt into me every day, the discoveries that I make, the fascinations that I find, the thoughts and ideas that my brain produces incessantly, and also the social, historical, aesthetic and ethical norms that have a collective effect regardless of my consent, but to which I can define an individual positioning within an astonishingly broad scope that corresponds to my self-positioning in the world. Compositional thinking is, that would be my assertion, structuring and formative thinking, not a bureaucratic one, but a potentially widely and anarchically structuring thinking, systemic thinking, which can initially and repeatedly reimagine the systems and forms to which it submits or pretends to submit. This can, may, and should also mean that things are mixed up and radically rearranged. Order and structure can often mean chaos from divergent points of view and vice versa. Side note, I keep thinking of those half funny, half unfunny tidying up art books by Ursus Berli as I write. It is therefore always self-referential. Johannes Kreidler has taken the compositional thinking of compositional thinking to the extreme with his new conceptualism. But compositional thinking also has the incomparable potential to open itself up to the world and virtually everything that exists in it, to relate to it, and above all, not to stop at the boundaries of the world, but to develop the language that expands the boundaries of the world by processing it. From this, it generates its political content as well as its timeless modernity. Compositional thinking is a way of relating to the world and its orders, contemplative, interpretative, affirmative, like Bach in his Passions, critical, subversive, randomizing, calculating, radically opposing, like countless examples of the 20th and 21st centuries. I have very often asked myself in my life whether I could do without composing, without writing scores, and for precisely this reason I couldn't, because I needed to find my way in the world and to open it up further for myself, because otherwise I would go crazy and not be able to find myself in the world. Me, back then, why did Bach compose music? My mother, back then, so that he could survive. Today, I ask myself whether Bach's composing actually allowed him to be closer to a sustaining God, or whether his God didn't rather allow him to find sustenance in composing. And because compositional thinking can refer to so much more than abstract phenomena such as loud and soft, long and short violin notes, or whatever other miserable possibilities the musical notation system offers, but also to the violin as an object, the person who holds it, the space that surrounds them, the time in which they live, and everything that is in this space and that happens in this time, I would like to formulate the claim that it constantly reinvents itself as an inclusive way of thinking that invites rather than excludes, that creates spaces of possibility, accessible forms, and that makes entering them an exciting experience of crossing thresholds and broadening horizons. This claim strongly suggests the interdisciplinary, holistic, site-specific, the work with the concrete, the tangible, the life-worldly, and the scenic. The compositional and also the contrapuntal are already inherent in these areas. You just have to spy it out, hunt it down, and grasp it with your hands, so to speak. Or, like in Peter Ablinger's Sitzen und Hören, neatly line up a few folding chairs in front of it and let it take effect on you. Together with director Johannes Schropp, I have been exploring choreographed and performative everyday aesthetics in areas such as sport and media spectacles for 5 years. A hammer thrower hurls a hammer beautifully, accompanied by a group of 400-meter runners in the background. Synchronized swimming, figure skating, unpredictable things happen on the love cam. A call and response at a rock concert takes on a life of its own. Or the example from the film said earlier, 2 people cross the street seemingly by chance, but actually with perfect timing. The boundaries between coincidence and aesthetics are fluid and can be played with endlessly. What could compositional thinking that reinvents itself as inclusive thinking be about? One central aspect is certainly the formulation and thinking in new parameters that are completely different from pitch, rhythm, or dynamics. Form would take on a prioritized position, and furthermore it would be about parameters and categories such as atmosphere, aura, momentariness, corporeality, objecthood, materiality, presence, alertness, absence, imagination, resonance, simultaneity, floating, being carried, paradox, unrepeatability, experiencing, coincidence, togetherness, reinterpretation, contrast, ambivalence, speciality, serendipity, defiance, freedom, care, ambiguity, or transformation, in which the form is as much inscribed as its overcoming.
Order creates chaos because decisions have to be made about what falls out of it. In an orderly world, it is possible to predict what will happen next. In it, everything that is random, unruly, or unpredictable is a threat that must be warded off. In this way, however, it constantly generates the ambivalence that it seeks to overcome. One could also say that disorder grows with the tasks that the guardians of order have set themselves. The practice of ordering knows no end, because if finality could be established, man would have to stop perceiving his environment as a problem and a task. Modern man does not know that his longing for unambiguity will never be satisfied, that order creates ambivalence. The more disorder the practice of ordering creates, the greater the destructive rage of those who cannot bear ambivalence.
Those who cannot bear ambivalence. That means adherents of authoritarian worldviews, fascists, racists, religious fundamentalists. This is precisely why the practice of artists is so important, whose other systems of order give rise to joyful disorder, chaos, confusion, in between, not either or, but either and, paradox, contradiction, ambivalence, and ambiguity, who do not create finality, but rather initiate processes, create detours, and keep the end of history in which only repetition of unambiguity reigns as far away from us as possible. The future is non-binary. Inter- and transdisciplinary art, with its clash of conventions, tools, and vocabularies in which they force each other to soften and dissolve, with its almost predetermined misunderstandings and moments of thinking at cross purposes, not finding each other, not fitting together, is one of the best platforms we have for this. It's all about what happens in the in-between, what interactions arise and reinforce each other, socially, between people of different backgrounds, temporarily, between idea and performance, spatially, between the world outside and the artificial space inside. Again, Randulis, quote, "Indeed, culture is one of the few social spaces where collaborative practices are not confined to the private sphere, as it is the case with family solidarity, but take place in public and where we systematically form relationships with strangers, mit Unbekannten," unquote. I would add, with the unknown, mit dem Unbekannten. For composers, this insight opens a great opportunity and challenge to deal productively and positively with the dialectical dilemma that every single structure they create goes hand in hand with unpredictability. Compositional thinking must therefore also mean embracing the unforeseeable. In conclusion, I would simply like to express these terms once again, let them have an effect and allow them to resonate, through which the compositionally informed interdisciplinary practice of the 21st century could, and I hope will, unfold.
Atmosphere, aura, momentariness, corporeality, objecthood, materiality, presence, alertness, absence, imagination, resonance, simultaneity, floating, being carried, paradox, unrepeatability, experiencing, coincidence, togetherness, reinterpretation, contrast, ambivalence, spatiality, serendipity, defiance, freedom, care, ambiguity, transformation.
Thank you.